He hadn't spoken a word to another soul in 3 months, not since spring faded and the last supply run ended. Just the wind, the fence posts, and the weight of a past too heavy to carry. Then came the footsteps. 3 women, children, dust in their hair and desperation in their eyes. Thaddeus Crow had built a life meant to be left alone. But that day, fate came walking up his road, dragging a storm behind it. The sun hung merciless overhead when the sound reached him. Voices, real human voices, cutting through the silence that had wrapped around his ranch like a thick blanket for years. Thaddeus dropped the hammer he'd been using to repair the fence and squinted toward the main road. 3 figures moved slowly up the dusty path, their shadows long and wavering in the heat. He hadn't seen another soul since the supply run to town back in spring. Now, here they were, 3 women, walking toward his property with small children trailing behind them. The youngest girl, barely more than a toddler, stumbled in the dirt and immediately started crying. One of the women scooped her up without breaking stride. That felt his chest tighten. People meant complications. People meant questions he didn't want to answer and conversations he'd forgotten how to have. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle leaning against the fence post, not out of threat, but out of habit. Strangers didn't just wander onto his land by accident. The lead woman had dark hair escaping from a faded bonnet. Her dress, once probably blue, had been worn to a dusty gray. She walked with purpose, despite the exhaustion clear in her shoulders. The other 2 flanked her, one carrying what looked like a small bundle of cloth, the other holding the hand of a boy who couldn't be more than 8 years old. As they drew closer, Thaddeus could see the desperation in their faces. These weren't travelers passing through or neighbors making social calls. These were people running from something. The woman in front raised her hand in greeting, but her smile was strained, almost pleading. "Sir," she called out when she was close enough to be heard without shouting. "We don't mean any trouble. We just need to speak with you for a moment." Thaddeus remained motionless by his fence. 20 yards separated them now, close enough for him to see the dirt on their clothes, the exhaustion in their eyes. The way the children pressed close to their mother's legs. The little girl had stopped crying, but her face was streaked with tears and dust. The woman took another step forward. "My name is Clarabelle. These are my friends Mercy and Violet. We've been walking since dawn, and we—" She paused, glancing back at the children, then met his eyes again. "We need help." The words hung in the air between them. Thaddeus felt something twist in his stomach, a feeling he'd worked hard to bury years ago. Responsibility. The weight of someone else's problems pressing down on him like a stone. He'd built this life specifically to avoid moments like this. But, as he looked at the 3 women standing in the heat with their children, as he saw the way the boy protectively positioned himself between his mother and this strange man, as he noticed how the youngest girl's legs trembled with fatigue, Thaddeus realized that some choices make themselves. He was about to speak when Clarabelle added quietly, "We just need somewhere safe to spend the night. We can't keep walking with the children." That's when Thaddeus saw what she was really asking for. And what terrified him most was that he was already considering saying yes. For 15 years, no one had stepped foot inside Thaddeus Crow's house. But when he opened that door and gestured them in, he knew he was letting in more than just 3 women and their children. He was letting in chaos. The silence inside his home felt suddenly fragile, like glass about to break. The women entered hesitantly, their children pressed close behind them. The boy, Mercy's son, kept his eyes fixed on Thaddeus with a weariness that reminded him too much of himself at that age. "Sit anywhere you like," Thaddeus said, then immediately regretted it. Where exactly were they supposed to sit? The parlor had one chair and a wooden bench he'd built years ago but never used. The dust mows danced in the afternoon light streaming through windows that hadn't been opened in months. Clarabelle settled onto the bench, pulling the youngest girl onto her lap. The child's thumb found its way to her mouth as she stared around the room with wide eyes. Mercy remained standing, one protective hand on her son's shoulder, while Violet clutched her small bundle of belongings against her chest. "You said you've been walking since dawn," Thaddeus said, leaning against the doorframe because sitting felt too intimate, too much, like accepting that this was really happening. "Where did you come from?" The three women exchanged glances. Clarabelle spoke first. "We were staying in a boarding house about 20 miles east, but the situation became difficult. Difficult how? Another pause. This time it was Mercy who answered, her voice tight with controlled anger. The man who ran it decided we owed him more than just money for our rooms. When we refused to pay his price, he said we had until morning to find another arrangement. That ass felt his jaw clench. He'd known men like that. Men who saw desperation as opportunity, who preyed on women with nowhere else to go. "So you left?" "We had to," Violet said quietly. "We heard about your ranch from a woman in town. She said you lived alone, that you kept to yourself, but weren't the kind of man who would hurt us." The weight of that statement settled over the room. These women had walked 20 miles on the word of a stranger, hoping that another stranger might show them kindness. The desperation it must have taken to make that choice made Thaddeus's chest tight. The youngest girl, Clarabelle's daughter, slipped down from her mother's lap and wandered toward the fireplace. She pointed at the cold ashes and looked back at him with curious eyes. "Fire's been out for weeks," Thaddeus said. "Haven't needed it." "When did you last cook a proper meal?" Clarabelle asked. And there was something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. Not judgment, but genuine concern. "I eat fine. I'm sure you do." But her eyes had already cataloged the empty shelves, the thin layer of dust on everything, the way he stood apart from them like contact might burn him. "When did you last have company?" The question hit harder than it should have. That found himself remembering the sound of laughter in this room, the smell of bread baking, the feeling of coming home to voices and warmth and life. Then he pushed those memories down where they belonged. "I don't have company," he said simply. Mercy's son tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered something Thaddeus couldn't hear. She nodded and looked back at him. "Samuel wants to know if you have any food. The children haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Yesterday morning, Thaddeus felt something crack inside his chest. These women had been walking for over a day with hungry children, hoping to find someone who wouldn't turn them away, and they'd chosen him. "I'll fix something," he said, moving toward the kitchen. "You all just make yourselves comfortable." But as he reached for the pantry door, Clarabelle's voice stopped him. "Mr. Crow, there's something else we need to tell you. Something about why we really had to leave so quickly." Thaddeus turned back to face them, already knowing that whatever she was about to say would make everything more complicated. And as he looked at the three women huddled in his dusty parlor with their tired children, he realized that the person he'd been protecting all these years by living alone was about to face his greatest test. Because sometimes the thing you're running from finds you anyway, and sometimes it comes wearing the face of people who need your help. The truth hit Thaddeus like a physical blow, but it wasn't what Clarabelle told him about their past that shattered his carefully constructed walls. It was what she said about his own. The boarding house owner wasn't just demanding money. Clarabelle continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He said he knew men who would pay good money for women like us. Women with children and nowhere to go. He gave us until sunrise to decide. Thaddeus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to this isolated place 15 years ago. Men who preyed on the desperate, men who saw vulnerability as profit. His hands clenched into fists before he forced them to relax. "That's not all," Mercy added quietly. "He sent someone after us. A man on horseback passed us about an hour ago, riding toward town. We hid in the brush until he was gone, but he was asking questions at every house looking for 3 women with children." The weight of their situation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. These women weren't just seeking shelter for the night, they were hiding, and by helping them, Thaddeus was making himself part of whatever danger followed them. But then Clarabelle said something that changed everything. "The woman who told us about you, she said, your name was Thaddeus Crow. She said you'd lost your own family years ago, and that's why you lived alone." She paused, studying his face. "She said you'd understand what it meant to protect children." The room went deadly quiet. Even the children seemed to sense the shift in the air. Thaddeus felt his carefully maintained composure cracking, memories he'd buried clawing their way to the surface. Sarah's laugh, little Emma chasing butterflies in the yard, the fever that took them both in a matter of days while he was away selling cattle. She had no right to tell you that he said his voice rougher than he intended. "Maybe not," Clarabelle replied gently. "But she was right, wasn't she? You do understand." Thaddeus turned away, staring out the window at the vast emptiness he'd chosen over human connection. The loneliness had been his penance, his way of ensuring he'd never again have to watch helplessly as the people he cared about suffered. But now these strangers were asking him to care again, to risk again, to choose their safety over his own carefully guarded peace. The youngest girl, Violet's daughter, had wandered over to a dusty shelf where an old wooden horse sat forgotten. Emma's horse, the one he'd carved for her 4th birthday, just weeks before the fever came. The little girl reached for it with chubby fingers, then looked up at him with eyes that were heartbreakingly familiar. "Can I play with this?" she asked in a whisper. Thaddeus stared at the toy he hadn't touched in 15 years, at the child who looked so much like his own daughter that it made his chest ache. Behind him, he could hear the mothers holding their breath, waiting to see if he would share even this small piece of his past. Before he could answer, the sound of hoof-beats echoed from outside, fast, urgent, getting closer. Mercy moved to the window and peered through the dusty glass. When she turned back, her face was pale. Someone's coming, riding hard up the main road. Thaddeus felt everything inside him go cold. The choice he'd been wrestling with was about to be made for him. Because whether he wanted it or not, the danger these women were running from had just found them all. The rider wasn't alone, and when Thaddeus saw who was with him, he realized these women had brought more than just danger to his door. They'd brought his own past back to life. "Get the children to the back room," Thaddeus said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made all 3 women move without question. "Stay quiet until I tell you otherwise." Through the window, he watched 2 men dismount near his gate. The first was a stranger, lean and predatory, with the kind of eyes that calculated profit and human misery. But the second man made Thaddeus's blood run cold, older, thicker, around the middle, with graying hair and a badge that caught the afternoon light. Sheriff Marcus Cale. The same lawman who'd stood in this very room 15 years ago, explaining why he couldn't investigate the doctor who'd refused to treat a poor man's family during the fever outbreak. The same man who'd taken money to look the other way while decent people died. Thaddeus grabbed his rifle from beside the door and stepped onto the porch. The weapon wasn't aimed at anyone, but its presence sent a clear message. This was his land, and visitors weren't welcome. Thaddeus Crow. Sheriff Cale called out his voice, carrying false friendliness. Been a long time. Not long enough. Thaddeus kept his tone flat neutral. State your business. The lean man stepped forward, all confidence and sharp edges. Name's Garrett. I'm looking for 3 women who ran off with something that doesn't belong to them. We tracked them this direction. Haven't seen anyone. See now, that's interesting, Garrett said, walking closer despite the rifle, because we followed their tracks right up to your gate. Funny how they just disappeared. Inside the house, Thaddeus could hear muffled whispers as the women tried to keep the children quiet. A floorboard creaked. Violet's daughter started to cry before being quickly hushed. The sounds were soft, but in the tense silence they carried like gunshots. Sheriff Cale smiled, the expression cold and calculating. Sounds like you've got company, Thaddeus. Mind if we come in and say hello? I mind plenty. This is private property. Now the sheriff set his hand resting casually on his gun. We're just looking for some missing property. 3 women who took something valuable from Mr. Garrett's establishment. Nothing more than a friendly conversation. That ass felt rage building in his chest. Property. They were calling these women property, and Cale was helping them just like he'd helped other predators 15 years ago when money changed hands and justice looked the other way. The only conversation I'm interested in, Thaddeus said, raising his rifle slightly, is the one where you explain why you're on my land without invitation. Garrett's mask slipped for a moment, revealing the violence underneath. Those women belong to me. They have debts to pay, obligations to fulfill. I'm not leaving without them. The hell you're not. The 2 men exchanged glances. Thaddeus could see them calculating odds, weighing their options. 2 against 1. But he had the higher ground and better cover. More importantly, he had something they didn't. A reason to fight that went deeper than money. Inside the house, one of the children whispered something that carried through the thin walls. Samuel's voice, young and scared. Mama is the bad man going to find us. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Thaddeus thought about Emma, about how she'd clung to him during those final fevered nights, how helpless he'd felt watching her suffer while men like these decided that some lives mattered less than others. Sheriff Cale took a step toward the porch. Thaddeus, you don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. These are dangerous women thieves. They've probably already robbed you blind. The only thieves I see, Thaddeus said, his voice deadly quiet, are standing in my yard. That's when Garrett's hand moved toward his gun, and Thaddeus realized that 15 years of hiding from the world hadn't prepared him for this moment, because some fights, once they start, don't end until someone doesn't get up. And with 3 mothers and their children depending on him, Thaddeus Crow was about to discover exactly what kind of man he still was. The first shot shattered more than just the afternoon silence. It shattered the last 15 years of Thaddeus Crow's carefully constructed isolation, forcing him to become the man he'd buried with his family. Garrett's hand had barely cleared leather when Thaddeus's rifle barked. The bullets splintered the fence post inches from the stranger's head, sending him diving for cover behind his horse. Sheriff Cale drew his weapon, but hesitated clearly, not expecting armed resistance from a man he remembered as broken and defeated. "Next one won't be a warning," Thaddeus called out, working the bolt on his rifle. "Get off my land." From inside the house came the sound of children crying quickly, muffled by their mother's hands. Thaddeus felt each sob like a knife in his chest, remembering another child's cries that he'd been powerless to stop. But not this time. This time he could do something. "You're making a big mistake, Crow," Sheriff Cale shouted, using his horse as cover. "Those women are criminals. Harboring them makes you one, too." "Then arrest me," Thaddeus replied. "Come up here and put me in chains. I'm waiting." The challenge hung in the air between them. Cale had the law on his side, but laws meant nothing when you were staring down the barrel of a rifle held by a man with nothing left to lose. And that's exactly what Thaddeus had become, a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. Garrett popped up from behind his horse pistol in hand. "I've got $50 for each of those women. Crow, that's more money than you've seen in years. All you have to do is walk away." "Counter offer," Thaddeus said, swinging his rifle toward the voice. "You ride out now, and I don't put a hole in you big enough to drive a wagon through." Inside the house, he heard Clarabelle's voice, soft but urgent, trying to calm the children. The sound of it reminded him so sharply of Sarah, Comfort, and Emma during thunderstorms that his chest ached. These women weren't just hiding in his house. They were depending on him, trusting him, believing he could protect them the way he'd failed to protect his own family. Sheriff Cale tried a different approach. Think about what you're doing. These women have filled your head with lies. They're not innocent victims. They're who ran off owing money. The word hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. Not because he believed it, but because of how casually Cale dismissed 3 human beings. Just like he dismissed Sarah and Emma all those years ago. Just property, just problems, just people who didn't matter. Sheriff Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the yard. "You've got 10 seconds to decide if you're leaving on your horse or over it." That's when Clarabelle made a decision that changed everything. The front door opened behind him and she stepped onto the porch, her hands visible, but her chin raised defiantly. "Mr. Garrett," she called out, "you want to talk to us? Then talk, but you leave this man out of it." Thaddeus felt panic surge through him. "Get back inside." But Clarabelle shook her head. No more running. No more hiding. She looked down at him with eyes that held more courage than he'd seen in 15 years. "Some fights are worth having. If you were Thaddeus, what would you do? Let Clarabelle face the danger to protect her from a lifetime of running or force her back inside, knowing it might mean they'd never stop hunting her? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what happened next would determine whether any of them saw another sunrise. Clarabelle's words cut through the tension like a blade through silk. But what she said next revealed a truth that made Thaddeus question everything he thought he knew about courage, justice, and the price of standing up to evil. "We didn't steal anything from you, Mr. Garrett," Clarabelle said, her voice steady despite the guns pointed in her direction. "Unless you count our dignity, our choice is our right to say no." Garrett's laugh was ugly cruel. "You signed contracts, all 3 of you, room board and services in exchange for debt forgiveness. Legal and binding. Contracts signed under duress aren't worth the paper they're written on," Thaddeus said, keeping his rifle trained on the men below. "Any honest judge would throw them out. Good thing Judge Morrison isn't what you'd call honest," Sheriff Cale replied with a smirk. Amazing how reasonable a man becomes when his gambling debts are forgiven. The casual admission of corruption hit Thaddeus like a punch to the gut. The same system that had failed his family was still failing others, still protecting predators while abandoning the innocent. But this time, he wasn't powerless to stop it. Behind Clarabelle, the door opened again. Mercy emerged, followed by Violet. All three women stood on his porch, facing their tormentors with a dignity that humbled him. They could have stayed hidden, let him fight their battle for them. Instead, they'd chosen to stand together. "You want us," Mercy said, her arm protectively around her son, who'd followed her outside despite her whispered protests. Then explain to these children why their mothers are property to be bought and sold. Young Samuel stepped forward, his 8-year-old frame trembling, but his voice clear. "My mom is not for sale. She's not anybody's property." The simple declaration from a child's lips carried more moral weight than all the laws and contracts Garrett could produce. That saw something flicker in Sheriff Cale's eyes. Not conscience exactly, but perhaps the faintest recognition that some lines once crossed marked a man forever. Garrett, however, seemed immune to shame. "Kid doesn't understand how the world works. Debts get paid one way or another. These women owe me 6 months of service, and I aim to collect. The only thing getting collected today," Thaddeus said, "is you and your corrupt sheriff. If you don't get off my land in the next 30 seconds, you're outnumbered," Crow Cale pointed out. 2 guns against 1. Bad odds for a man with so much to lose. That's when Thaddeus smiled. The first genuine smile he'd felt in 15 years. "Sheriff, you're making the same mistake you made all those years ago. You're assuming I care about my own life more than doing what's right." He shifted his stance, and suddenly his rifle was pointed directly at Cale's chest. "The way I see it, the world would be a better place with one less corrupt lawman in it. And I've got nothing left to lose by proving that point." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. 2 hardened men with guns facing one isolated rancher and 3 desperate women. But something had shifted in the balance of power. Thaddeus was no longer the broken man who'd retreated from the world. These women and their children had reminded him who he used to be, who he could still choose to be. That's when they heard it. The sound of more horses approaching from the main road. Multiple riders moving fast. Garrett grinned, thinking reinforcements were coming. Sheriff Cale straightened, confident that superior numbers would end this standoff in their favor. But as the dust cloud grew closer, Thaddeus could make out something that made his heart race. These weren't Garrett's men riding to support him, and they weren't carrying the kind of weapons that suggested a peaceful resolution. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. The riders cresting the hill were about to turn this dangerous situation into something far worse. And in the middle of it all stood 3 women who'd already lost everything once betting their lives on a lonely rancher's ability to keep them safe. The riders who appeared weren't reinforcements for either side. They were something far more dangerous. Witnesses. And what they witnessed would force Thaddeus to make the hardest choice of his life. 5 men rode up the path. Their leader, a grizzled rancher Thaddeus recognized from town. Wade McKinley, a man who commanded respect throughout the territory. Behind him rode 4 of his hands, all armed, all taking in the scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Well, well," McKinley said, dismounting slowly. "Sheriff Cale, what brings the law to Thaddeus Crow's ranch?" Cale lowered his weapon slightly, clearly calculating how this new development affected his plans. Official business, Wade. These women are fugitives from justice. Funny, McKinley replied, studying the three women on the porch. They look like mothers protecting their children to me. His gaze shifted to Garrett. And you are Garrett. I represent the Riverside boarding house. These women violated their contracts and stole property when they fled. McKinley's expression hardened. Riverside. That's the place the preacher's been talking about in town, the one where women disappear and nobody asked questions. He looked back at Cale with disgust. You're helping him. The sheriff's confidence began to waver. Wade McKinley wasn't just any rancher. He was respected, influential, and most importantly, honest. Having him as a witness changed everything. The law is the law, Cale said weakly. Whose law? McKinley shot back. The kind that protects women and children, or the kind that sells them to the highest bidder. Thaddeus felt a surge of hope. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't fighting alone. But that hope died when Garrett pulled a second gun and pointed it directly at little Samuel. Enough talk, Garrett snarled. These women come with me now or the boy pays the price. The world went deadly silent. Samuel stood frozen, his young face pale with terror. Mercy started forward but stopped when Garrett swung the gun toward her. One step closer, and I paint this porch with his blood, Garrett warned. McKinley's men reached for their weapons, but Garrett shook his head. 7 armed men against one desperate businessman. I like my odds better when I've got insurance. That's when Thaddeus understood the true cost of protecting others. It wasn't just about being willing to die. It was about being willing to watch innocents suffer for your choices. The same helplessness he'd felt watching Emma slip away from fever now threatened to destroy him again. But Clarabelle stepped forward, placing herself between Garrett and the boy. Take me. Leave the children and take me. I'll go willingly if you promise to let them stay here safely. All 3 of you or the boy dies, Garrett replied coldly. Mercy moved to stand beside Clarabelle. Then we all go, but the children stay. Violet joined them, forming a wall of maternal protection between Garrett and their young ones. 3 women who'd already sacrificed everything now prepared to sacrifice themselves again. Thaddeus felt something break inside his chest. These women weren't just protecting their children. They were teaching him what real courage looked like, the kind that counted others' lives as more valuable than your own. But as he watched 3 mothers prepared to walk back into hell to save their children, Thaddeus Crow realized that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to refuse to let anyone else join them. The rifle in his hands suddenly felt like it weighed nothing at all. What happened next lasted only seconds, but it changed Thaddeus Crow's life forever. Sometimes, the moment that defines you comes not from what you're willing to sacrifice, but from what you refuse to let others sacrifice for you. No, Thaddeus said quietly, stepping down from the porch. Nobody's going anywhere. Garrett swung his gun toward him. Stay back, old man, or I'll. The shot echoed across the ranch like thunder, but it wasn't Thaddeus who fired. Wade McKinley's rifle smoked in his hands as Garrett crumpled to the ground, his weapon spinning away across the dirt. The businessman clutched his shoulder, cursing and writhing in pain, but very much alive. Threatening children, McKinley said grimly, working the bolt on his rifle. That crosses every line there is. Sheriff Cale started to draw his weapon but found himself facing 5 armed ranch hands who clearly had no patience for corrupt lawmen. His hand froze on his gun as he calculated odds that had suddenly turned very much against him. Here's what's going to happen, McKinley announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. You're going to get your wounded friend there, load him on his horse and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. And, Sheriff Cale, you're going to forget you ever heard of Riverside Boarding House, or I'll make sure every decent person in the territory knows exactly what kind of law you've been enforcing." Cale looked around at the faces staring back at him. McKinley's men, the 3 women on the porch. Thaddeus with his rifle still ready. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and most importantly on the wrong side of justice. Without a word, he holstered his weapon and helped the groaning Garrett to his feet. "This isn't over," Garrett wheezed as they loaded him onto his horse. "Yes, it is," Thaddeus said simply. "And if I see either of you on my land again, McKinley won't get the chance to wound you first." The 2 men rode away. Garrett slumped over his saddle, and Cale's dignity trailing behind them in the dust. As they disappeared over the hill, an extraordinary silence settled over the ranch. Not the empty silence of loneliness, but the peaceful quiet of safety restored. Clarabelle was the first to move, scooping up her daughter and holding her tight. The little girl had been clutching Emma's wooden horse throughout the entire confrontation, and she looked up at Thaddeus with eyes full of trust. "Can I keep this?" she asked, holding up the toy. Thaddeus felt his throat tighten. "It belongs here," he said softly, "just like you do if you want to stay." The 3 women exchanged glances, hope and disbelief wearing in their expressions. "You mean that Mercy asked?" "This ranch has been empty too long," Thaddeus replied. "Could use the sound of children playing again, could use the sound of laughter." McKinley clapped him on the shoulder. "Good man, Thaddeus. Your Sarah and Emma would be proud." As McKinley and his men rode away, Thaddeus stood in his yard watching 3 children chase each other around the fence posts while their mothers talked quietly on the porch. The sun was setting, painting everything in warm gold, and for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't dreading the approach of night. Clarabelle walked over to him, her daughter still clutching the wooden horse. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me that some things are worth fighting for." That evening, as lamplight spilled from windows that had been dark for too long and as children's laughter echoed through rooms that had forgotten the sound of joy, Thaddeus Crow realized that sometimes the greatest courage isn't found in facing your fears alone. Sometimes it's found in letting others stand beside you and choosing to protect rather than withdraw and opening your heart, even when you're afraid it might break again. The 3 women made his ranch their home, raising their children in safety and filling the empty spaces with warmth and life. Clarabelle taught school in the nearby town. Mercy opened a small bakery. Violet tended the garden that bloomed behind the house. And Thaddeus, he discovered that the man he'd buried with his family had never really died. He'd just been waiting for a reason to live again. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel now. Click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, where a single act of kindness in the unforgiven West unleashes consequences that will leave you breathless. Click on the video now.